This is Platform Diaries with Shane Williams, who chews the fat with entrepreneurs, startup founders and thought leaders on what it takes to traverse the wall between startup and scale-up.
Attracting and retaining the right people that go on your startup to scale-up journey is terribly difficult. Employee share options plans are increasingly being adopted by Australian scale-ups, mimicking what's happening in America in an attempt to solve that challenge. Stick around to learn how to get your ESOP right. You're listening to Platform Diaries, and I'm your host, Shane Williams. In today's episode, Steve Grace, founder and CEO at the Nudge Group, joins us to dive deeper into the topic from last episode. We talk about how to get your ESOP right when you know your team is here potentially for a good time rather than a long time, some of his lessons from implementing them in his businesses, and we attempt to demystify some of the terminology and options around employee share options plans. I trust you'll enjoy the interview. So Steve, welcome back for our second episode. Welcome to Platform Diaries.
I can only imagine the sheer volume of people who have been sitting on the edge of their seat for the last 2 weeks, just waiting to hear what we're going to talk about today. So thank you for having me back again.
You're right. And honestly, when we left last time, I wasn't quite sure what we were going to be talking about either. But in the context of the last episode where we were saying, there's this journey of an employee and, early stage employees don't necessarily go on the entire journey. And this idea of share options and whatnot, which I think in some respects is probably people listening who are like, oh, hang on, shares and options and what do these mean and how do they work for me? But in the context of people not necessarily being on the journey the entire time, I think it's really interesting. So the big build up, the topic is you're here for a good time, not a long time. So why is it critical to get your ESOP right? There you go, the drum roll.
I love that. Gosh, you just pulled that one out. And yeah, ESOP, employee share option plans, right? So be careful when we talk about this subject because there can be a lot of complexity and misunderstanding in this. And just so everyone is aware, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not giving legal advice here.
No, this is not legal, financial, or any other type of advice. It's just a couple of guys having a yarn. Maybe we should just describe what is an ESOP and are they all the same?
So I think the most interesting thing about ESOP stands for employee share option plan, as we just said. And it's a way of giving your staff a share in the business to ensure that hopefully they will be rewarded. And no, they are not all the same because there's a number of ways they can be rewarded. There are dividends out of a business when they later become profitable. There are profits if a company is to be sold, a trade sale or partly sold. There are potential for people to buy out other shares from other investors later stage. And there's also obviously floating a business and taking it to an IPO. So there's a lot of what they call liquidity events, which is when those shares that you have been usually gifted in some form, and that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways because sometimes you have to pay for them, sometimes you don't, can be worth something of future value that is far greater than they are when they're given to you. Oh, that's a terrible definition, but hopefully that makes sense.
No, I think it does. I mean, it certainly unblocked my thinking. So then I suppose, putting it in context, I'm a founder, I've started my business. It seems like if I can keep my wages low in the beginning to try and get more runway and try and prove this product out, but also to give some of the early staff some skin in the game in terms of help me build this thing together. It seems like on the surface, that's all largely upside, right? But I suppose the question is it all upside or have you seen it go badly? And I don't know, I suppose, what are some of the underlying assumptions that come with that context?
It's a really good question. Look, ESOPs have become very popular here in Australia in the last 2-3 years. Prior to that, there wasn't that many. There were some, and everyone's heard the stories of the Facebook early employees and the Google early employees and even the Canva and Safety Culture early employees. But first up, ESOPs are not all the same. There is a trend of the way that they look at the moment. But actually, an ESOP plan can be designed absolutely any way you want, and every single one is probably different to some degree, unless you've come through some sort of incubator where you're using a template. But I've had 3 different ESOPs in 3 different companies, and they all look totally different. And you can really create any rules and regulations in there that you want. So what I feel is that the ESOP plans in Australia are unfortunately not thought about enough in terms of the subject we're talking about, start up to scale up, and here for a good time, not a long time, all that kind of stuff. But I've seen them go very well, and I don't say I've necessarily seen them go very wrong, but there are a lot of cases where if you don't stay with that business until whatever that liquidity event is, you lose your shares. And if you lose your shares or your options, and I'll define the difference in them in a second, then you've taken a lower salary for no benefit at all, which is madness. Really would be the definition of madness. So I think there is a lot of misconception and understanding that if you get shares, they're yours forever and so forth. So just to be clear, an ESOP plan is an option plan, and an option is the right to buy a share. You actually don't have to buy that share. So it's the right to buy a share at a specific price. And usually, unless you specifically want to execute that option for a particular reason, you wouldn't do that until such an event happened later down the track. Now, that's how they've always been viewed. It's not equity until you buy it, and you buy it at whatever price the company is valued at that time. And the idea is that if you don't buy it now, it doesn't cost you anything. But if the shares are then valued 3 times as much, when you buy it, it's all just a paper transaction. You never actually have to give any money. You just get the difference, right? That's how most people would view them. However, if you are talking about what we're talking about, which is early stage specialists, well, they're going to leave. That's what they are. They're early stage specialists. If they do their job right, the company is going to go into that scale up phase, which we obviously talked about before, and they will most likely move on. And in Australia, although it has begun to change, ESOPs don't enable them to necessarily guarantee them keeping that. It can be up to the founder, or it can be up to the board, or whoever it is, at their discretion as to whether or not they get to keep those shares. If they're fired or something like that, they are what they call a bad leaver and they lose them. But if they're a good leaver and they're leaving for the right reasons, it's not always clear whether they get to keep that equity or not, which means they've taken a lower salary for no gain, which is crazy. So I think that founders need to be very mindful of that when they're creating ESOPs plans, and look at who they're giving it to, why they're giving it to, and what they're expecting that person to do. If they believe they're going to be there until the end and they've had that kind of conversation, again, we're back to dialogue and open communication, then they might want to give them a slightly different type of share or a different type of plan. Whereas if they're just there for the good time and the long time, as you put it, and it's kind of understood that at some point they're going to move on, then they might want to change their ESOP for that individual to make sure that person knows they're going to retain that value so that they will take the lower salary. So it does get all very complicated, but I think the biggest problem that I see is people don't think about it. They just bang out a standard sort of 4-year vesting plan with a 12-month cliff, which means that you don't get anything for 12 months, and then the amount that you've been given slowly vests over that 4 years to try and retain you, and not thinking about anything else. And there are so many clever things you can do with those ESOP plans, and you can give everybody slightly different deals as well. And I just don't think people take enough time about it because they don't understand it, and they just throw it in there and hope that everyone thinks it's a great idea.
So I'm guessing there's 2 elements to that. One is an underlying assumption that everybody who joins will be here forever, or at least until such time as you float or whatever the event is. And then secondly, that you understand what it is that you're getting into.
I think so. And I think a lot of employees don't do enough research. The ones that do are almost seen as painful by the founders because the founder doesn't really understand it. And now he's got someone questioning him and he's like, can't you just get on here and work here? I'm excited. You should be excited. We're all in it together. So it can be a lack of understanding on both sides, I think. And you do get employees who take it to another level and they go and take advice from their cousin who's a lawyer, but he's actually a family lawyer. He's not an ESOP lawyer. And there's all those sorts of problems. And I just don't think there's enough information and education out there around ESOP plans for people to really understand how to use them effectively and for employees to understand what their real value is. There are companies out there that are trying to change that. There's a company called Cake that's trying to sort of change that. But again, they're not quite where they need to be. And I think people need to start taking their own responsibilities. But more so, founders need to understand how to use these effectively. And they just don't, unfortunately.
And I suppose that's fair. Not every founder is coming from a financial or a legal background, right?
No, and it's just another thing to do, right? But I do believe that they are fundamentally one of the most important parts of working within this space is in startup and scale up. So it's something that people need to get right. Whether they outsource it or not, it needs to be talked about. It needs a couple of hours of time to say, what am I trying to achieve? This is what I'm trying to achieve. We'll design the plan this way. And that almost needs to be questioned with every person. You know, what am I trying to achieve with this person? What am I trying to achieve with this person? So that you can make decisions around how to use ESOPs, which can be immensely powerful if they're used in the right way.
And I suppose similarly, it's not a point in time at the beginning of your startup, that's what the plan looks like. It sounds like, as you say, when you get to scale up, maybe that needs to change.
You can change plans. You can do all sorts of things. The trick is to build them right at the beginning because they're expensive to change. And to give yourself lots of different options at the beginning. because you don't know what's going to happen. And I think there's nothing more demotivating for employees who take a lower salary for an ESOP plan where there's no planned exit for 10 years. They don't want to work there for 10 years, so it's really got no value to them because they know they're going to lose it when they leave. That's a demotivating factor. And they often don't realize that until they've been in the company for a year, and then some smart aleck comes in and tells them, and then that can do damage that way as well. So it's just a subject where I think there's a huge amount of power and a huge amount of benefit for everyone, but no one takes the time to do it.
So then conversely, businesses who do it well and get it right, what does that look like?
I think having employees who are truly on the journey with you, there's no question you see a difference. So my first business had an ESOP plan. It was incredibly ineffective and really actually caused resentment, which was awesome. So I'm an expert at this. Whereas the one I currently have, it's a completely different feeling. You know, the engagement, the level of interest, the thoughts, the willingness to come to me with ideas and all those kinds of things, all the things I want so that I can become, and it's interesting we're talking about this because I'm going through that startup to scale up phase at the moment, so that I can become more of a CEO and less of a founder. You need people with that skin in the game because they are going to think like you did as a founder, and you need that thinking to constantly be there as you get caught up with other things as the business grows. So it creates a lot of innovation, I think.
So then you've been on this journey more than once, and obviously you've talked about good and bad ESOPs, but just thinking more broadly around your advice for previous you around how to get it right. What's your, I don't want to use the term top tips, but, like if you're having this conversation with previous Steve, what would be the advice?
So this is my third time round, so I'll go with two previous Steves.
Okay.
First previous Steve, grow up, take the time to understand it, because I took none of it and I just left it to someone else who was outsourced, and it didn't mean anything to them, and I just assumed it would be fantastic for everyone. I was quite young when I started my first business. I was in my 20s. It didn't interest me. I was far too busy trying to build a business. So I literally just wanted it in place because we were supposed to have one, but had little to no interest in how it worked. That's a terrible way of me. With the second one, I took a little bit of an interest, but it all seemed a bit too complicated. So again, I kind of learned enough, but didn't question it. And I took someone else's advice who'd been a founder, who I shouldn't have. And we put in a plan that actually also it created a lot of initial excitement. And then over time, that dwindled when everyone realized the reality was quite different and was a long way away. So I think it's, like I said, it's really the time. I think when I was very young, I invested no time. Second time around, I invested some time, but still didn't take the time to really say to myself, what am I trying to achieve with this? We were doing it for the right reasons. We wanted to give the staff skin in the game. We wanted to give them upside. But we didn't think about, one, what was our strategy for our next event of liquidation, whatever that might be, and two, what was I trying to achieve? Was I trying to reward certain people? Was I trying to retain people? Was I trying to give dividends? All those questions. So it's really a thing that I think can be done in 2 or 3 hours, sitting down with a lawyer, a good lawyer, who knows how to do ESOPs for startups, and who gives you a questionnaire that asks you all the questions of why you're trying to do it, what you're trying to achieve, what are your plans, and then you can create, quite simply, a plan that's going to work and be flexible enough for you to achieve what you're trying to achieve with it.
And ideally, motivate your staff, not demotivate.
It's definitely a plus to do it that way, yes. That would be some great advice for me, as Steve number one.
The interesting part for me, having not ever had share options, is if you're really early stage, that if you don't leave before the liquidation event, they're worth nothing to you. And I think the broad assumption would be, surely I get something for them, even though we're not there yet, or how do I exit?
Well, see, you can do. Like some of them, if you leave, they have to buy you back at whatever the new value is. Some of them, you just lose them. That's it. Just gone. And that's what a lot of them are. And that's the opposite of the States, where the States, you don't lose them. And they have an entire employment market of early stage specialists. We don't have that here. So you have people staying for the wrong reasons then as well. So honestly, you could talk about this subject for days. There's so much complexity to it. I think the key thing is everyone thinks they're the same, and they can be, you can literally design them in any way you want. You can do anything with them. And I don't think people realize how much flexibility there is.
It almost sounds like there's a business in just solving that problem here.
Well, so if you look at companies like Cake Equity, they're trying to do that with a technology platform. And what they do well, but it only works for box standard ESOPs because the complexity, again, is too great. The only way to do it is with a lawyer. And unfortunately, it's not cheap to set one up. But then, most good things rarely are cheap. And I think the problem is people take these box standard ones and think they're fit for purpose because someone else has got that one. But everyone's trying to achieve different things. And it's just worth taking the time. I reckon to set up a good ESOP is going to cost you $5,000 to $6,000, which is quite a lot of money. But the payback by setting it up right now and having it, rather than having to change it later, which is a disaster, is definitely worth it. And you can set them up relatively simply at the beginning for a few $100s, but have the ability to add that on later. It's not something you necessarily have to do at day one because most people don't get any ESOPs for the first 12 months or 18 months or whatever it be. So I think it's worth having a really simplistic, it's a bit like having something that you can add to it, right? Rather than having something that's cookie cutter and then is difficult to change.
Yeah. The risk would be, am I spending, because, the assumption being coming into this, I don't understand what the ESOPs are. I'm a founder and I just want to get on with business. I know I want them to be motivational. I know I want to attract staff. But behind that, $5,000 for a document that I don't really understand, which then locks me into something in the future, feels scary. So I can see why people are like, well, I know I've got to have something, so I do it. Let's call it Steve 1.
There's a lot of bad advice out there. It's like when you do your terms and conditions at the beginning, when you get caught out for the fourth time because it's only one page rather than 6, you go, actually, we're going to have to spend some money on getting this right. Same thing. It's the same thing.
Mate, thanks for letting me get you back on the microphone and dive into that, because I think it would be remiss of us not to have the chat. Probably also, before you go, I'd love you to just give us a bit of a yarn about what is the Nudge Group, what do you do, and how do you help?
Good question. So the Nudge Group is, I'm trying to think of a good way to describe this. I'm going with growth consultancy now. But the Nudge Group was designed to help founders go from a 2-person startup all the way to a unicorn or an IPO, and the journey is all the way along that. And that includes helping people get funding. It includes helping people create ESOPs in terms of putting them in touch with the right people, launching into new countries. We have offices all over the world. Recruiting, we have on-site models to help them with their HR and onboarding. We have a number of media outlets to help them grow their presence and their brand. So it really is continuously growing in product lines to just really be that person that goes alongside the founders as they go through this journey that is totally mayhem.
And if anybody feels like they could use your help, I'm sure they'll reach out. We'll put some contact details for you in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me, second episode, and no doubt we'll have you back again soon.
I can't wait.
You've been listening to Platform Diaries with Shane Williams. To find out about how Shane enables digital businesses to scale, please visit shanewilliams.com.au. Thank you for listening.